thank you, thank you, thank you for the hard work of putting this together. And, you know, I think I'll begin by quoting something someone said to me. It's David Arkless, whom you've gotten to know a bit. He's a little outside the box, you might say. But behind every great man is a great woman, and he was telling me about his aunt who died, and she had been a terrific force in his life, really helped shape who he is. And actually, she arrived at the pearly gates. You understand my doctorate's in theology. And she arrived at the pearly gates, and Peter was there and said, wow, you had your hands full trying to shape David. So we have a place for you here, and not only that, you have a certain right. And that is that if you want to, you can interview anyone that you want. She was a journalist, I should add. And so she said, well, that's a no-brainer. I'd like to speak to the Virgin Mary. And Peter said, you know, there's actually a long line, but we'll work it out. And so the moment came, and she was standing there suddenly before the Blessed Virgin. And she said, I have just one question for you. I am, in addition to a journalist, I've been a great lover of the arts. And I have been in cathedrals all over the world. And when I go to the museums and the like, I see pictures of you, and you're holding this Savior of the world, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And there's this look on your face. It's not joyous, you know. It's this kind of, and then I go and I look at statues, and I think, well, maybe, you know, maybe in this church, or, and there you are holding this infant with the ball in his hands, and the look on your face is, what's going on? And Mary said, look, this has to be completely off the record. And she said, and I will tell you, but okay. I've never actually told this to anyone. But we were really hoping for a girl. Connie's there doing this on the front row, you know. Now, I have to ask you, in addition to being a hilarious story and being very well delivered, by the way, why is that funny? Interesting thought, isn't it? Why that is so hilarious. Well, it's funny because there's this idea in our culture that with that kind of authority, with that kind of possibility of being the savior of the world, comes certain sexual organs. Comes, maleness, you know, and it seems preposterous that could be associated with femaleness. And this idea of the difference between maleness and femaleness, these gender equity questions, they really are at the heart of so much of what you've been talking about this morning. Right on, sister. Oh, I can tell I'm in Atlanta. And the people said, amen. Ooh. Hey, women. Thank you. Thank you. So I don't know about you, but as I said, I have at least 3 children, and I remember, you know, lying in bed and having the little books to read to them, and we're going on and on about the dwarfs, and they go off to the mines, you know, hi-ho, hi-ho. and they come back, and all of a sudden I'm reading about what she's doing. Do you remember? She's sweeping, you know. We're not going to go there, honey. Fortunately, my kids can't read at the time. So I say, and so the 7 dwarfs came back with their axes. See, honey, there's the picture of the 7 dwarfs. And there's Snow White. And she had been all day long studying her law books because she was going to take the bar exam. Because she decided she wanted to serve on the Supreme Court. And I just had the best time. And then the dwarfs fixed dinner, and then but she helped them clean up. She helped them wash the dishes. Oh, I just had the best time. But it's so in our culture, you know? It is just throughout. You know, if you think about all those nursery rhymes you hear, you just think about, do you remember Sing a Song of Sixpence? Remember? Sing a song of sixpence, right? Do you remember the second verse? Okay, you can sing it with me. The king was in the counting house, counting out his money. Yuck, right? Where's the queen? The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. Oh, Lord. I mean, the only gainfully employed person. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, and what happens to her? Along came a blackbird and snipped off her nose. You know, I mean, it is so much a part of our culture. So when you take that and you think about what this spectacular morning was talking about in terms of human trafficking, how do you apply that? Well, all of that human trafficking is happening in the context. It's all happening in the context in which we think it's very funny that a deity could be female. Or we think that the maid somehow ought to be eating bread and honey, and Snow White ought to be sweeping, you know, for the dwarfs as they come home. So let's look at it in terms of that mosaic. Now, we have a lot of difficulty when we talk about human trafficking, because first we've got definitions, I'm working on it this way, you're working on it that way, I don't understand how this fits in with that. Have you had some of that rolling around in your heads? Like, what actually is human trafficking compared to sex trafficking? Aren't girls who are being sold, aren't they humans? Well, what about labor trafficking? You mean being in a brothel isn't labor? I mean, you know, it just gets really difficult. So if I could just take a moment and describe that broad sense, because we had to do it with our private foundation, which is working on this and has been working on it several years and is going to for another decade. So if you take this whole big piece of human trafficking, and that's what we're doing at Harvard, we're looking at the whole big piece. Well, a huge part of that is the debt bondage in India. You're born into a family that already is in debt. And there's no way that you can work that off, in fact. And so you're essentially a slave, because the wages you're getting will not ever pay off that debt. And there's a certain class in India, and as I say, it's huge. If you take that group out of the calculation, then the large majority of the people who are being trafficked are the women and children for sex. And in fact, we talk some about the domestic workers and others who are brought in to places for labor, but if in fact they are there without the possibility of leaving, they are highly vulnerable to being sex slaves, essentially. So even that line gets separated. Gets very fuzzy. Some people talk about the sex trafficking globally, all right? So Somali Mom is a great example of that. And other people say, you know, that's bigger than we can deal with. Let's focus on the US. Now, clearly, even then the lines get very porous, because what's happening globally, you know, is that a lot of women and girls are being brought into the US, and you've heard those statistics. I'm going to try very hard not to repeat the statistics you've heard, because statistics, well, they're staying in a certain part of your brain, and the stories stay in another part of your brain. So let me try to not repeat those. So in terms of then, our foundation, which is called Hunt Alternatives Fund, which we started in 1981, we decided, okay, what is our comparative advantage? I've worked all over the world. I work on 40 conflict areas. So we could go global, but that's actually much, much, much bigger than we have the resources to address. So let's take something we know. Let's do the sex trafficking, because I know something about women's and policy. And then let's confine it to the US, because that's going to be hard enough anyway when we focus on 50 states. Well, when you take sex trafficking, where do you start? And I know that that's been rolling around in your head, like, where do we start working on this? You can either work on the supply, the distribution, or the demand. So let's take those apart a little bit. You could go in and try to rescue the girls and the women. God bless the people who are doing that. God bless them. And I wouldn't have them move from that work for a minute. We actually went around and talked with all kinds of organizations that were doing that. And we said, so what are you doing on the demand side, that you're working on the supply side? And they said, we don't have the money. We don't want to take money out of what we're doing, which is going onto the streets or into the internet and rescuing these girls. So I'm with you. That's a piece of the mosaic. Nick Kristof described, however, that when he first was able to rescue a couple of girls, the awful thought for him, and by the way, that was a good thing for him to do, but the awful thought was that those beds were filled immediately with a couple more girls. So then you could say, well, I'm going to work on the distribution, and that is the pimps and the traffickers. And you heard discussion this morning about what it's like to bring those cases. Those men and women who are the pimps and traffickers have a lot of money, and they can hire some of the best defense attorneys around. So it takes years to build those cases, and a lot of them, a lot of times they lose. We lose. So what does that leave? So there's the supply, and that seems pretty endless. I mean, how are you going to wait until you eliminate poverty and desperation among girls? Let's see, the distribution is going to take years and years and years. What does that leave? It leaves the demand. Yeah, but that's not going to work because boys will be boys, you know? I mean, they've always done this. They've always been buying women and girls. Boys will be boys. Boys. Well, what do we do? Like when they're little boys and they're fighting with each other. We say, what do we say? Yeah, boys will be boys. And then what do we say to those boys? Thank you, thank you. We say, stop it. Just stop it. And if you can't not fight, you're going to go stand in the corner. That's what we do. We don't, I mean, if you go to a school, they don't say, oh, well, the boys are all fighting. The girls are sitting here in the classroom, but the boys are outside fighting. That's not what they say. They say, shape up. You know? So what happens if we try to do that? Well, I think we can get there. That's the demand part. Isn't that interesting to think it's not just boys will be boys? I actually made that the title of this address. Boys will be boys, not. So, okay, so let's say we are going to try to address the demand. How do we do that? Well, you know that people like Don, is Don still here? Don Conroy, who's working with huge corporations to address this kind of, sex trafficking. She's focusing on the children because that's something that she said that corporations can really understand. Nobody thinks it's okay to buy children. And in fact, I had a really interesting discussion. Ashley Judd, who's an actress, she and I put together a meeting in LA, and Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher had someone there, and they were trying to decide on their campaign, and they decided to focus on children also. And K. Rita Anderson here, there's really, really important work being done focusing on children, and in part because it's so egregious, but also because that's something the public can get into. Like who's going to argue about a 40-year-old having sex with a 12-year-old, right? And that's a piece of the mosaic, just like rescuing and just like taking to court the pimps. Those are all pieces of the mosaic. But what we decided, unlike what Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher did with their Real Men Don't Buy Girls, we decided that we would say, actually, real men don't buy other people's bodies. They don't have to, right? And the issue, the way we took it, and I'm not suggesting anybody else should, but the way our foundation decided to take it is not to cut it off at the 18th birthday. You saw the stats about the age at which a woman in the life entered that, the street life. And do you remember the age? Yeah, 12 or 13. Which means that if she's purchased 10 times a night, 6 nights a week, let's give her a day off, by the time she's 18, she has been statutorily raped 15,000 times. I did that math. I decided it couldn't be right. I did it again. Decided that was impossible. I did it again. Now, the idea that at that point, on her 18th birthday, happy birthday, you're now a consenting adult. Oh, come on. She's been on heroin at that point for 5 years, just to make it through a night. So we said, okay, we're going to focus on the whole range. And also that one reason to do that is because a man who's purchasing doesn't go up to a woman and say, by the way, how old are you? I want to make sure you're 18 and not 17. Or, you look 21, you look 25, but that's not the conversation. He doesn't go up and say, have you been trafficked? Is there any coercion going on? I really want to be clear. No, that's not what the transaction looks like. And when I say going up to, I'm talking about the internet as well as on the street, because it's very much the same dynamic. So, what is it like for these men who are finding these girls? And who are these girls? You've heard a lot about that today. An FBI agent described it this way to me. He said, he asked a pimp, where do you, this is not the Johns I'm talking about, he asked a pimp, where do you find the girls that you're going to put on the street? The pimp said, I go to a mall. I look for a girl who's walking around in the mall by herself. Okay? When you were 14, did you walk around in a mall by yourself? You don't do it. That's not what we do. Girls go together. So he goes up to a girl by herself and he says, "You have beautiful eyes." And if she looks him back in the face, he says, and she says, "Thank you." I just keep going. I just keep walking. And I find the next girl. And I say to her, "You have beautiful eyes." And if she looks down at her feet and says, "No, I don't," I know I've got her. So that's what we're talking about. And you take a girl like that, who's then told to call him daddy, because he's, in fact, 20 years older than she is. And then he says to her, "You know, will you be my girlfriend?" And he sleeps with her multiple times. And then he says, "Hey, honey, if you love me, I need you to bring in something to, help us along. I need you to bring in some money." And that's how it leads. One thing leads to another. Then you want to put her on the stand? You want to put her on the stand in a court and ask her if she is a victim of force, fraud, or coercion? No. So the onus in this supply, distribution, and demand needs to be on the demander. He, in fact, broke a law. Yeah. And if you want to stop child prostitution, stop prostitution. So why am I saying prostitution? I thought we were talking about sex trafficking. That gets confusing. Well, if you ask women who are being prostituted and girls, first of all, anyone under 18 by definition is being trafficked. So if you ask the women, are they being pimped? 80 to 90% are. And almost always that involves some kind of force or fraud or coercion. So the overlap is probably 90% in terms of trafficking. Now, we don't want to impinge on the rights of the sex workers, though, because they need to be given dignity. And by the way, I'm a feminist. I use the F word. Not afraid of it. And so, you find in part of the feminist movement, this sense of, could we please dignify women who have been trashed? And the answer is yes, of course. How do we do that? Don't believe you do that by creating a system where other girls and women are brought in to that world. So should we have a public policy that is built around protecting their rights? And actually, the answer is no, that's not how we create public policy, according to a 5% minority. It's just not. In the antebellum South, there were slaves who said, actually, this is working for me. I am part of a family that I love, and they love me. We've been together for several generations. They are educating my kids. I know where my next meal is coming from, and they are kind to me. And we as a country said, we can't create our public policy about slavery around the tiny exceptions. We as a country are not going to have slavery. And so it's very hard when you hear those voices saying, don't mess with my career. But you have to step back, and the evidence is crushing in terms of the effect on the huge majority of the girls and women that are brought into this this world. You should see the pictures. Go online to demandabolition.com and look at the pictures. They're mugshots of girls when they're picked up. It's from the police station at the beginning, and watch over time the same girl and see what happens to her within just a very few years. So that has to be the basis of your public policy decisions in terms of it's got to be the guys. You've got to go after the demand that is producing this. I have the feeling that we have a room full of people who care. Would you say? I mean, that's the sense I have, that you wouldn't be here if you didn't care. And I also am going to bet that there's something that's not sitting right with you. And it's not been sitting right with you all day. Because you're feeling angry, you're feeling energized, you're feeling motivated. We have got to do something. We have got to do something to stop these guys. And as soon as you say, these guys, you're realizing there's something happening inside of you. Because the same way when you think about those pictures up there and you say, oh my God, that was somebody's daughter, that was somebody's sister, you know, that was somebody's mother. These are human beings. At the same time, you're saying to yourself, a little voice maybe, these guys, oh my God, that's somebody's son. That's somebody's brother. That's somebody's husband. So the trap is that we get into dehumanizing the guys as we're trying to think of saving the girls. And you are very serious people here. And I imagine that that doesn't sit well with you. So, I don't know about you, I don't want to hate. I don't want to go around hating. You're going to hear from Naomi? Have they already heard from you? Tutu? Not yet. The extraordinary thing about the Tutu family is that they were in a situation where hate was by far the most logical reaction to apartheid. And they are a family of love, of laughter. Oh my God, they're funny. You know, you're going to enjoy them. You're enjoying her. Yeah? So how do you, at the same time, be so motivated to stop these guys and yet to, in some kind of sense, understand them? And recognize what they're going through. Well, what on earth are they going through? As we wrestled with this as a foundation, there was a conversation that went on in our board meeting. And one of the board members, who's a man who was 60 years old, said, I know what, we should call this program Arrest Demand. And interestingly enough, it was my daughter, our daughter, who's 26 years old, who said, no, we're not going to do that. That may be the solution. But I don't want to have any kind of name on what we're doing that is a put down to these men. Isn't that interesting that it was the 26-year-old daughter who carried the day in that conversation? So that's why we came up with Demand Abolition. And in the next 10 years, we're putting $7.5 million into this work. And what we're doing is creating the infrastructure to connect Georgia, what y'all are doing, with New York, because New York has some spectacular work going on, with Massachusetts, who has a bill before the legislature right now that is dynamite, with Colorado, who's already passed their bill and has a vice squad that is right on it, with Illinois, where Jennifer Buffett is working on the End Demand, the Illinois campaign. So our job is to connect you all, let you know what each other is doing, what the best practices are, put the research behind it, what really works. The Cook County Sheriff has billboards in Chicago that says, you come here to buy sex, it's going to cost you $1,250 and we're going to bust you. Does it work? You know, does it make any difference? We're going to put the research behind that. So that's what we're doing. We have partners like Manpower with David Arkless. They're going to bring in a lot more millions. David, you're not, where's David? You're not responsible for the entire millions yourself, but other people in this room are going to do it. Don't worry. But what we want to do as a foundation is also to look deeper. Why are these guys doing it? And there are a lot of different reasons. For some of them, it's self-medicating. And they're not very smart about how to handle when they get depressed. And you know, they've learned that one thing they can do is go and buy some attention, some complete self-gratification, someone who will do exactly, you know, whatever they want. We'll talk about that in a minute. For others, they're acting out, you know, they're adolescent, and they know they shouldn't be doing it, so they're going to do it. You know, it's kind of like a rite of passage for them. And there's another group that is addicted, and a lot of them hate what they're doing. And they have such a compulsion, and that is built. I was just talking to a neurosurgeon because my husband died of a brain tumor, and so this was the doctor who worked on him, and you know, just give him an extra year. And I asked him, I said, you know, is there anything, I keep hearing there's something in the brain that happens when you repeat an action. He said, oh, there's no question. There's a neuropathway that you develop. And by the way, the porn use among the guys who are picked up is astronomical. And that neuropathway gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And when you become addicted, it is such a strong urge. And you know, fortunately, we have ways of dealing with that addiction, which we can talk about in a minute. But here's the one that is really scary, and you all know that. I mean, can you think about the other reasons guys would do this? What'd you say? They've been abused themselves. That's a very, very big one. And they're playing it out. Again, huge number. What else? Louder? Thank you. And that's really scary. It's about power also, and the need to control. And they say things like, if I've bought her, she's going to do exactly what I say. She's mine. And they don't care if it's rape, in other words, forcing her into a sex act. They've already bought her, right? So it's different what you do in terms of what's causing this. But first, before we get into what we do, like, why do they need to stop? What's the case to them? I was asked that by a journalist who wrote a piece on this for Newsweek. And I actually stopped and thought, you know, I have a degree in ethics. I ought to be able to sit down and think this through. And I spent weeks, actually, writing this out, thinking it through. Why do they need to stop? And I'll just say three things about that. One is, there is a coarsening of conscience that goes on. And these guys, they they know what's going on. If you ask them, we did some research. We interviewed 100 buyers and 100 non-buyers. We put a little ad in the paper saying we're doing a study on sexual attitudes. 600 plus responses. We did sorting so that we would match them up in terms of income, and education level, et cetera. And then we did 3-hour interviews with 100 of each. And we asked them if they thought that these women and girls that they were buying were doing so out of their own free will. And you know, the huge majority of them said, no, she's been lured into it. She's been forced into it. She's been abused as a child. But somehow that wasn't enough to stop them. Isn't that interesting? So imagine what that's like for them, that they are so cutting themselves off from a sense of caring. By the way, in terms of the danger, and this wouldn't surprise these guys, the chance of a prostituted girl or woman of dying of homicide, did you all hear that statistics this morning? Her chance of dying from being murdered is 200 times more than normal. So it's so high that the Dallas police are now asking the girls and women if they can take a DNA sample. As the policeman is telling the recruits, you were born with a name. You deserve to die with a name. And it will give your families closure. Yeah, that's grim. And these guys, they actually know about that. And if you ask them, if this were your daughter, would it be okay? They say no. You know, these are guys, a lot of them live in the suburbs, as you know. The majority of them have wives, children, or girlfriends that they're committed to, interestingly enough. And so, yet they're able to so separate this inside of themselves. As one of them said, in terms of, do you think she's choosing? He said, well, I guess if there were a burning building and a person was jumping out of the burning building, I guess that would be a choice. You couldn't have said it better, right? What does that choice mean? A second reason, besides the coarsening of conscience, and I'm getting toward the end of what I'm going to say, a second reason is the damage to their own relationships. I mean, this is devastating. The wives and the girlfriends very often find out, and they leave, they split, and you've got a divorce, and you're visiting your kids every second week. If you get that, you know, if you got any kind of custody rights, given the reasons for the divorce. So families break up, very, very hard for the kids. And by the way, when asked what would deter them, 88% of the buyers said that they would stop if their family member would find out. 88%. So they're walking around knowing that it would be very, very dangerous to their own relationships, including their employers, by the way. And these guys are very, very vulnerable to blackmail because of that. And the third is the damage to themselves. You know, when you walk around with that lack of integration in your life, where you've got, you know, all of this good going on, you're running this company, you know, you're sitting in the church pew, and you've got this secret going on about where you were last night. And that's pretty hard to live with. So the coarsening of conscience, the damage to their relationships, and the damage to themselves. These are all compelling reasons that you can work on this issue of stopping the demand, not just out of a sense of anger, not just out of a sense of hate. You can do it out of a sense of compassion, about caring for these guys. This is not a good life that they're living. So, question is there anything we can do about it? And I'll tell you some reasons that this is going to work. You know, I like to think really boldly, but I'm not stupid, right? And so we're not going to be pouring millions and millions of dollars into something that cannot work. No, it's big, it's difficulty, but it is going to work. And before I tell you why, I have to, the immediate question is usually, and by the way, Suzanne Durkin wrote this in one of the questions. You said, how does legalization of prostitution impact the situation? There is a lot of thought, well, you know, this is so hard. Let's just legalize it. Then you're going to have health care checks and, you know, and women will pay taxes. Yeah, well, seriously. There's a great book. You should get this book. It's called The Johns. And it's by Victor Malarek. And before you get my book, get his book, okay? And here's one of the quotes from him. He says, legalizing prostitution is a gift to Johns. It is an invitation to rape, and it will only exacerbate demand. It will not empower women, as the message that it will convey is, it's okay to buy and sell the bodies of women. And by the way, Amsterdam, the great example, the red light district, the mayor has now shut down half of the red light district because trafficking, legal, let me say it differently, legal prostitution attracts illegal prostitution because it's a magnet for the buyers. And as I said, they're not distinguishing between those. So, if you want to find the biggest hotbed of organized crime, go to Las Vegas, because it attracts all kinds of other crimes as well. The legal prostitution does. Okay, Nancy, how do you pronounce your name? Garakti? You wrote a question, and you asked about prosecution. What's being done to diminish demand, like prosecution or developing negative social stigma for those who seek out prostitutes? And how come the girls are dirty where the customers are not, right? So we asked the guys, by the way, we asked the guys, what would it take to deter you? I mentioned that earlier. What would it take to deter you from buying? And it was so interesting. I mentioned the 88% who said if a family member would find out. And there's similarly very, very high numbers. A sex offender registry would be huge if they were put on a sex offender list. If their picture was going to be in the local newspaper, billboard, internet, by the way, that's devastating to their wives and children. So if there's a way you can stop this without the public shaming, if there is a way, think it over. Guess what? They didn't want their cars impounded. I love that one. I mean, boys and their toys, right? They probably didn't want their yachts taken away either. You know, I just love that one. Or their driver's license. They're real concerned about their driver's license. They don't want a high fine. They don't actually mind the $50. Some states have no fine. And they don't want to do community service. Sorry. But, you know, all of those depend on what? Yes, they depend on getting arrested. Like, none of those things is going to happen if you're not arrested, and they know that. And Martina was talking earlier, I think it was you, talking about the impunity, right? And, you know, God bless us when we create laws, and And then we get so pleased that in this last year, there have been, 12 convictions, right? And often we're talking about the pimps, but even when we're talking about the Johns, the numbers are tiny, and it is impunity, essentially. But the arrests are the key. So you've got this circle here. You've got a governor of Colorado who says, I'm going to take this on, who then influences the legislature, and the legislature is influencing them, and Colorado has now passed a bill that says instead of $100 to $500 for first offense, it's going to be $1,000 to $5,000. Good step. The governor signed it in early June. Okay, now you got to get the mayors or county commissioners, who then get the police chiefs to tell the vice squad, this is your priority, because the vice squad listens to the police chief, and the vice squad right now will tell you we're not going to do it because the prosecutors won't prosecute. And you've got to get the prosecutors trained, and they'll say, yeah, but the judges will throw these out, and they don't want to work on a case that the judges don't care about. So you've got this circle, but you come back to the political will. And what's the in-between? It's you all. It's you all in this room. It is the public outcry. And when the public starts demanding change, that circle starts working. And if it's broken at any point, you've got to figure out where it's broken. If it's the DAs, you've got to get your act together and say, we're going to pay for training for the district attorneys. We're going to find whatever the National Association is, and we're going to get them organized here. Now, can this work? I don't think so. I mean, we've got 11 or 10 girls and women who are being arrested for every one man. Good Lord. And we've got to flip that? How are we going to do it? I mean, get real, Swanee. Well, think it over. I was born in 1950. Do the math really quick. Yes, I am 61, but I look great, don't I? Yes, thank you. Oh, by the way, this is my mother's dress. So I figure it's about 1963. What do you think? Is that the style? It needs a little tuck right here. It'll look better, don't you think, when the skirt comes in a little bit more? I mean, seriously, we have to laugh. This subject is so hard. It's just so hard. Okay, so I was born in 1950. When did we start the littering campaign? 1960, would you say? Okay, so we would go to the Dairy Queen, and we would get a hamburger and a milkshake. And what we would do is we'd eat the hamburger, cheeseburger actually, and then wrap it, scrunch up the paper, and we'd throw it out the window, and then we'd finish our milkshake, and then we'd throw it out the window, and didn't think a thing of it. Is anyone old here? Thank you. Do you remember that, Laura? Okay, so Laura remembers. Does anyone else remember? Are we the only schmucks in the room? I'm sorry. Well, anyway, that's what we did. That's what we did in rural Oklahoma, in Idabel. So at some point, I don't know who did it. Somebody said, we got to clean up. Okay, and they did several things. Do you remember what they did about the litter? Fines. And also, don't be a litter bug. Was that brilliant? Who wants to be a bug, right? Don't be a litter bug. There was a campaign, and there was another thing. Do you remember? It's smaller than a bread box. Yes, what were they called? They were called litter bags. You all are too young. Okay, so there were these little plastic, you know why you don't remember? Because it was such a short time. There were little plastic bags with holes in them, and we would put them on the cranks of our windows. Y'all remember? Is it coming back? Okay, so then what happened? Yeah, thank you. So then what happened? What happened is we got electric windows. We called them power, didn't we? Power windows. Okay, so what happens to the litter bags? There's no place to hang them up. And then what happens to the litter? Well, you know what? we had changed our ways within, I'm going to guess, 5 years. With don't be a litter bug, and there's a fine, and the fine in Georgia is $250. It's not huge, right? But there's a fine, there's a consequence. And we had, for just a few years, that little plastic bag. Seat belts. When did we start seat belts? 60s? Late 60s? Okay. Probably inspired by the littering campaign. You know what? The fine for not wearing your seatbelt in Georgia is $25. But do you know what gets to me? It's my kids. Oh my gosh. If I start driving along without a seatbelt, Mom, stop, put on your seatbelt. Somebody got to the kids, right? Yeah? I mean, it's really interesting how it wasn't the fine, it was the kids. Somebody got to the kids. You know, the same thing happened with, and this is a lot more serious, domestic violence. The fine for domestic violence is, you know, there are different kinds of domestic violence. It's 1 to 20 years, it's $1,000 to $5,000 in Georgia. But I think a lot of that was the police training, that they didn't walk in and see a bloodied up, bruised woman and say, would you like to press charges against the father of your 3 children? They just said, come on, guy. Come on, buddy, you're coming in. That police training and social awareness, it is reprehensible, is it not, to beat up your girlfriend or your wife? So we were able to do that through a social campaign, awareness campaign. Okay, those are all examples of how in just one generation we made a massive, across-the-board social change. Well, we can do this. And when people talk about, well, it will take so much time to affect this, it doesn't have to. It does not have to. We can do this. It's going to be massive training of law enforcement. It's going to be figuring out how you have a special court for traffickers so you don't have to train all the judges. It's going to be figuring out how to get the governors or the mayors or the police chiefs to take this on as a cause, how to stir up the public will, how to get into the schools and convince the boys and the girls there that this is their cause. But this is all doable, and it's going to happen also because the guys are involved. In closing, it's with partners like that that we're going to make this. You can't do it as simply a women's issue. We are too marginalized to do that. But ultimately, it's because it is our issue, all of us. And when I say all of us, I'm talking about all of us. You know, I know a few survivors, and they are so eloquent and so determined and so strong. I don't think I know, as far as I'm aware, I don't think I know any pimps or traffickers. But I know a lot of Johns. In fact, I know a whole lot of Johns because they're in my family around the Thanksgiving table. And they're my rabbi and they're my imam. And I sit next to them at church. And they are the guy who dated my college roommate. And they are living on my block. And they are working, I don't know, maybe I have a John working in my foundation. That's who Johns are. They are guys we know, and they don't talk about it to us. They talk about it often to each other, but they don't talk about it to us. And they must become part of this solution, in fact, for their sake. And they can when they feel like there are other guys who are calling them into this. And it is that cultural shift that you all have talked about throughout the morning that has to happen. Because we will find the day when I'm driving up to pick up my grandchild or my great-grandchild at a school, and I will hear on the playground kids singing, "The king was in the nursery reading to his daughter. The maid was at the opera soaking up some culture. The queen had left the counting house. The checks had all been signed. And God is in her heaven, smiling down on humankind." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Power to you.